everyone. It's nice to see the hall packed, and it's nice to see it packed 2 days in a row. We had Gayatri here yesterday. I don't seem so. A very warm welcome to our speaker today, and also to Githa, who has very kindly agreed to moderate this particular session. So I'll first request Naveen to introduce the two people on the dais today, and then he'll hand over to Gayatri, and she'll take the session from there onwards. So Naveen.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. How can you hear what I am saying? I am so far away. Conversations, encounters across cultures, intense, investigative, probing, wanting to know, discovering along with the subject of your questioning that the balance has shifted and you yourself are under a desperately interested microscope, maybe benign, but microscope nevertheless. You cannot simply call this an encounter or an interview. It appears to take on the shape of a conversation amongst equals. The scales tip again, and you find yourself becoming an acolyte one moment and a teacher the next, sometimes both in an extremely delicate moment of clarity. What tremendous freedom! What tremendous responsibility! Manipulation or malleability? Ownership. Every thought, every memory, every emotion has a landowner. Things that happened are meant to belong to you or to me, like a privilege acquired at birth, a litany made up of this is mine, yours, ours. Often it is nations that appropriate entire histories, lives, other nations, people, writing and the rewriting of things that later become our truth, yours and mine. Living under the heel of collective ownership can be crippling, to say the least. How does one free the event of one's life from the clutches of a possessive, even dictatorial memory and turn it into a literature of resistance? Ngũgĩ von Thiong'o is a world-renowned Kenyan writer, scholar, and social activist. Ngũgĩ's diverse body of work includes novels, short stories, plays, articles, essays, and poems, which have been translated into over 60 languages. His novels include Weep Not, Child, A Grain of Wheat, The River Between, Petals of Blood, and more recently, Wizard of the Crow. The Black Hermit was the first of several plays of which the trial of Dedan Kimathi is often considered his best. His play, I Will Marry When I Want, led to his detention for a year without trial by the Kenyan government. His non-fiction books, such as Decolonizing the Mind, has earned him a reputation as one of Africa's most articulate social critics. Ngũgĩ is a distinguished professor of comparative literature at University of California, Irvine, and has received 12 honorary doctorates and numerous awards, including the 2001 Nonino Prize for Literature. Ngũgĩ refers to himself as a language warrior because of his fight for the recognition of his native, Ikyu, and other marginalized languages. Githa Hariharan has written novels, short fiction, and essays over the last 3 decades. Her highly acclaimed work includes The Thousand Faces of Night, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book in 1993, the short story collection The Art of Dying, the essay collection Almost Home, Cities and Other Places, and the novels The Ghost of Vasu Master, When Dreams Travel, In Times of Siege, and Fugitive Histories. She has also edited A Southern Harvest, a volume of stories in English translation from 4 major South Indian languages, and From India to Palestine, Essays in Solidarity. Githa is also involved with an initiative called Indian Cultural Forum, which discusses issues of concern to writers, educators, and cultural practitioners, and offers support to individuals in the cultural and academic fraternities. Githa.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank you, all of you, for being here and being part of this conversation. It's a great pleasure to continue our conversation, which we began a few days back. I thought we would begin with a very plaintive question I had from a writer in the audience when I was in conversation with historian Romila Thapar recently. And this rather wonderful writer came up to me and said, why do we have to keep going back, all those years back, to colonialism? Can we talk about now? So obviously I could have said something about the power plays of the present, as you have said, you know, which means we have to go back to the past. So I wanted to ask you, especially for the young people here, what is your earliest or most vivid memory of the kind of colonialism you saw in Kenya?
Yeah, first of all, let me say, I really, before I respond, continue that conversation which you have been having, let me say how glad I'm to be back in India. This is my second time in India. The first time was in 1996. So there's a couple of years in between the two visits. And each time, it's like a revelation to me in so many ways. And we can talk about that later. But I just want to say how much I've been gained a lot from this visit. I started by going to Calcutta because I'm a guest of Seagull Publishers, really, who have issued my book, Secure the Base. But what really impressed me was Naveen's sort of love of the book. Not only what the book says, but how it looks like, how it feels as a book. So for me as a writer, I sort of felt very good to be in that publishing house for that period, okay? But I cannot answer your question without mentioning a friend here. I don't know how to describe this, but of course you know the speaker last night was Gayatri Spivak. Okay. Let me tell you a secret. Is she here? Oh, you're not here.
She is there, so gossip is most welcome.
So you're not listening. Huh? We first met in 1996. 66. I thought you were not here. In 1966. And I met her in Iowa, which is now, of course, became famous also for its international writers workshop. And she was assistant professor of French. And even those of us who were visiting then were sort of, wow, this young lady. And she's already a professor of French at this American institution, you know. Very impressive indeed. But she did see me do something that is, whenever I meet, she reminds me of my attempted riding a horse. Huh? And she could see the terror in my eyes. So she keeps on reminding me of that encounter with a horse and so on. Yeah? But we've interacted over many years at many places, and we are also colleagues really at University of California, Irvine. She has a regular visiting position at Irvine, and we always so she's one of us also at the University of California, Irvine. But then when I call her thinking she's in Columbia University, she answers, I'm now in Japan, or in Tokyo. Then I think, are you still in Tokyo? No, I'm in South Africa. No, I'm... Yeah, so it's wonderful meeting her. There's one more thing I'd like to mention. Today I was very lucky. I met two ladies at one is Romila Tapa and one is Jane. It was amazing how much, first of course, they are good writers, great historian, but their memory of African and African nationalism, and they know some of those nationalist figures in person. So I was totally amazed. In other words, when we met at Romila's house, we went back to the past. So we moved from the present to the past, to the 50s, okay? And it's very important, I think, for us to go back to the past is part of us. Yeah, put this way. The present today is born of yesterday. And today contains both yesterday and also tomorrow. Today is pregnant with tomorrow, but, from the past. So they are connected, really, So we must always remember our past, particularly colonialism, because so many things which are happening today actually are as a result of many years of colonial rule in Africa and all over the world, really. And but we can elaborate on that later.
But to come back to my question, your work has these very vivid images of what actually that means. These words we use: plunder, incarceration, dislocation, of course, murder. You've described what it's like to find an entire village burnt down, razed to the ground, people literally being moved out, people being killed, which is why I thought, those vivid images take us back to that particular experience of colonialism.
Yeah, when I think of, currently I'm writing my memoirs, and I've been publishing a few of them. And one of the memoirs, which unfortunately I did not bring a copy, I could have read sections from it, is called Dreams in a Time of War. And the title was deliberate, because I was born in 1938, literally on the eve of the Second World War. So I grew up seeing, one of my brothers was actually part of that, fighting on the side of the British. So I grew up seeing these military trucks all around me. And then in 1945, and I also interacted with Italian prisoners of war, the one who had been captured by the British in the East African fighting zone, right? So they were imprisoned in Kenya, and I saw them building roads and so on around us. And then the war came to an end. The Italian prisoners of war disappeared. I never know where they went because I was a kid, more or less. And then, almost immediately, there was Mau Mau armed struggle against the British. Let me just explain just a little bit to give you a context. Kenya was colonized by the British in 1995. Okay, and Kenya is what is called a settler colony. And let me just put it in another context. In Africa, and for that matter in the world, there are two types of colonies. One was settler colony, where white people or Europeans came and settled and took the land from the native owners of the land. Okay? And we have examples of settler colonies. America is one, New Zealand, Canada, Australia.
Algeria.
Yeah?
Algeria.
Yeah, then we come to Africa, Algeria, and Kenya, South Africa, Zimbabwe.
Palestine.
Yeah, and Palestine. And what's common in all those areas was a question of land, as opposed to the other type of colony, which you might call the more protectorate type of colony, I believe, where in fact there was no, there was exploitation and other forms of repression, but land was not settled. So land was not technically an issue in the same way that it was in other those settler colonies.
That differentiation between Kenya and Uganda, that one is wounded
yes.
and one
For instance, Uganda was a colony, but not a settler colony, right? What was common also in the settler colonies, particularly in Africa, is how independence was won. It was through armed struggle. And the Mau Mau, or what we correctly call Kenya Land and Freedom Army, was actually the first of its kind against the colonial power in Africa. Algeria was around the same time, but maybe 2 years later. But yeah, so Kenya, Algeria, in some ways, our examples or other examples of armed struggle against settler colonial power. Others, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, were to come later. Yeah. So that's the background against which I got some education. In other words, my struggle for school was against the background of war, of devastation, of bullets flying in the streets and so on, of dead bodies and so on, right? So it's important for me as a writer to remember that, because that past is what makes me the writer that I am, and it's impacted the world in which I grew.
In fact, I think you use the word remember with a hyphen. Remember that the past, which I think is actually quite evocative. Just a side question. What happened to that brother of yours who joined the fighters?
Yeah, by the way, in fact, I've got a book called, it's got different names by different publishers, but the original title, there are a series of lectures I gave at in Harvard, actually my Harvard lectures, and they were called Remembering Africa. Remembering Africa. Later, it was published under the title something torn and new. Yeah, my brother Wallace Mwangi, I write about him in time, Dreams in a Time of War. He went to mountains. He fought, I don't know for how many years. Later, he was captured, and then he was taken to a concentration camp, and he was only released literally on the eve of independence. And he really inspired me a lot. I remember one incident, really, and this is very important. Let me just say it, please. He was in the mountains. We don't know what had happened to him. But on the eve of a very important exam I was doing that would take me from primary school to high school, he came to a house with other fighters at 3 a.m. in the morning, because that's the only time they could travel, okay? And why did he risk his life coming to see us or see me? Was to emphasize the importance of education and to wish me luck in my exams. I've always remembered that because they came and they disappeared, But they didn't seem to be afraid. I was very amazed by this. We were trembling with fear, but they seemed to be very relaxed. Later they ate, and then they went back to the mountains, But the fact that he would come to see me, to tell me that no matter what happens, I must stick to our dreams for education was very important to me. But he passed on very recently, actually, about 4 years ago.
Well, you mentioned going to school and the importance of education, the value placed on that. And of course, that's for all of us who've had colonial or post-colonial, quote-unquote, education, it's a very mixed bag, isn't it? We've benefited in a way from some of the advantages given to a few, but it also means a kind of process of questioning that education. So I actually wanted to ask you about what you have described as cultural imperialism. Before we come to present day, continuity of cultural imperialism, but the older one, when you were in school, when you were in that college, which sounds very much like St. Stephen's in Delhi, a kind of a privileged place where a lot of very talented people met.
Yeah, I went to my school was called Alliance High School, and it was really schools in Kenya, by the way, segregated. There were schools for Europeans only, schools for Asians only, and schools for Africans only. And Alliance High School was one of the most elitist for Africans only. It was a boarding school, and for me, it became like some kind of refuge from the war going on. I felt when I was inside the school, I could more or less shut off the cries of going outside, the bullets, the sound of bullets, the screaming there. But every time I left the place and went back to the village, I would experience the reality of what the villagers were experiencing. And I remember one time after first term in this boarding school, I returned home. I had done quite well in the school, in the Alliance High School, first term. And my mother was really very much influential in my education. I'll talk about her a little bit later. Was a very big impact on my life. So I wanted to go home and show her my results, or whatever I had done. Let me just describe this a little bit because it didn't make sense until. What happened was it's my mother who first sent me to school. Okay, she could not read or write, all right, but she's the one who supervised my homework. She bought my first set of uniform, shorts and shirts to school, and she supervised my homework. And every time, but since she could not read or write, she did it by asking me questions, how I had done in school, and so on. And I remember once blurting out, I got 10 out of 10. And she says, "Is that the best you could have done?" And then another time I come back to be more emphatic. I say I got 100%. Igana kwa igana. And the same question, is that the best you could have done? So when I went to high school, I was thinking, my mother might, if I go back, I wanted to tell her the results, but in my mind I was thinking, I could anticipate the question, was that the best I could have done? So I'm enjoying this encounter with my mother and so on. So I go to the village where I was, and I find my house was no longer there. The entire village had been burnt down, erased. It's like met with desolation. It's horrible. And I did not know anybody. I didn't know what had happened. Because letter writing in those days was very minimal. It's not like today where you have these things, these magical, the magical thing I see all you carrying. Where you do like this. And then you talk. You actually, I don't digress. But it's very funny because like in New York, when I first saw those things, people going about, they are alone and they are talking. And then he's alone because they put some of those things here, and they are alone, and then you see them laughing. Or in one case, very angry, somebody. Now, with those technology, if you saw someone doing like that, talking to themselves, or being angry or laughing by themselves, you'd think they were mentally challenged. But now, everybody, I suppose, is mentally, not challenged, but mentally, whatever. Yeah. So we didn't have those kind of things in those days. So I go back, and it's raised to the ground, and only later do I discover. I go looking for, until I found a person who told me, no, they have gone to a new village, a concentration village. They were forced to leave their old villages and go into a concentration village. Again, that desolation is part of me, and it's actually central to my other memoir called In the House of the Interpreter. Yeah.
And in addition to this physical desolation, there is also, what shall I say, a kind of cultural desolation that is the result of, you speak about, I think this is something all Indian students will identify with, reading about daffodils and, remember we were talking about what our first impressions of England was when you finally went there.
Yeah.
So that kind of having to remember what you studied.
Yeah. But let me be clear. When you were going through it, it did not sound like cultural desolation. It was very nice going around talking about daffodils and talking about snow. And although we're not seeing snow except on Mount Kenya. So in a way, it didn't come across as desolation in that sense, or it came across as, now we are very learned. Huh?
A disconnect.
Yeah.
Because, in India, if you read about rain being terrible, you don't really understand.
You
because,
don't
of course,
understand,
we wait for the rain.
You're just seeing it. You as primary school, you used to sing, Rada is bana, Randa is bana, Roko Rwada. That's London is burning. Rada is bana, London is burning. Because that's how the sounds came across to us. As Rada is bana, Roko Rwada.
Well, actually, once I saw a little video of neo-literates, adult literacy classes in Kerala, I think, and they were being, taught things like, London bridges falling down and so on. Mm-hmm. So this continues.
London Bridge, House of Parliament. Actually, now that you talk about it, there was a textbook we used to read, English textbook, I still remember, because it was Oxford Readers for Africa, and the two characters, John and Jane.
That's right.
And they went to...
we all know them.
They went to Oxford, and they lived either in London or the other way around, They went to a place called... I think they lived Reading, but they also went to school in Oxford, and they took trains. And one day they went to Thames, to London Zoo and House of Parliament, but I had never seen them. Yeah. But those characters, John and Jane, became actually real characters, Jane and, So when I first went to England, and I went looking for where Jane and where is Jane? Where is John? Where did they
Probably
go to
in
school?
Africa.
Yeah, probably in Africa.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So it did not really come across at the time. It's only when you come to reflect upon it years later, you understand what is happening to you, right? So reflection years later is what made me wait a minute. How come? What was really, when you come to think of it, what is happening when you teach a child that environment of England or Germany is more real to them than the environment of their surroundings? What does it mean to make a child, first of all, know all the names of the rivers of Europe and the mountains there, and not start with the rivers around them? It's as if the rivers of Europe are more rivery, or more how shall I say, more rivarious.
Yes, yes, yes.
Or the mountains are more mountainous, mountainity. They are more mountainity than others,
But in addition to the physical characteristics, there's also the colonial experts on the native mind. And you've spoken of having to read literatures, all of us, where others, for example, Isaac Denison, you've mentioned, Karen Blixen, in Out of Africa, how she sees Africa,
right.
a rather zoological view, because she says that the big game explains the African mind
what she
to
says,
her.
What I like, I remember the phrase in Out of Africa, and what I learned from the game of Africa was later very useful to me when I came to contact with the Africans.
Yes.
In other words, to understand the African mind she was helped by her understanding of animals. But when you go back to this question of rivers, it's very important because essentially it was part of the whole system of alienating the colonial child from his base, from environment, right? Education, knowledge begins where we are. Knowledge, in fact, begins with our body, literally, right? And then, like a child, begins by understanding sort of mothers, this part of the mother, because of the milk she drinks from there, Sometimes, their ears and so on. And sometimes children, initially they don't even think that this is part of them. So they think something here, it might do like that. Then later they're, it's part of my ear, and so on. And you go on adding knowledge. Because knowledge is no more than the idea of knowing. So you start from here, you go there, you go on adding, and so on. That's very important as a process of knowledge, process of knowing, okay? But when you tell or you make us believe that knowledge begins not from you and what's around you, but begins from elsewhere. So in that sense, Europe more or less becomes the beginning of knowledge. It's like the education system is asking you to see yourself with the eyes of an outsider, right? To place yourself in Europe and then see yourself so backwards, okay? Instead of the other way around, where you begin where you are, you go on adding to what you see. And by the way, it's actually very, I can show you. Okay, can I show them?
It depends on what.
Well, not where. Well, I mean, no, let me show you about this actual knowledge. Now, please watch me carefully. Huh? I want to go and look. I'm going to look for Spivak. Right? What I do? There are two ways I can do that. I can try and jump. Like we might have an argument with you. You won't see where Spivak is, come to where I am. Okay? That I move from here to there to go and look for Spivak. Right? Or I can say, no, I don't want to do that. I'll start from where I am. And they, oh, this is where I am with the knife. You see? I'm going on adding, and I'll do like that, and I'm sure she's somewhere there, okay? What I'm trying to say is I go on adding. I start from there. There's no question of my jumping from here to say, let me jump over there. But what the colonial system is telling you to actually jump over there and start knowledge from there and come backwards to look at where they come from, okay? Right.
But suppose, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. Suppose we get to where we are now. You use the phrase, where we are now.
Right.
And look at the fact that many things are not very different. The structures are pretty much the same, except now it's not the Europeans, it's not the colonizers, but our own people. So I think now we have to talk about the now. So if we could actually talk about Kenya, India, other places, I have to mention a brilliant detail you have, which I think in a way sums that up. And you say after Lumumba is assassinated, that Mobutu takes on the name Leopard because that is reminiscent of Leopold.
Leopold, yeah.
And in a way that very cruelly sums up the way in which we have what you call a neocolonial situation. So shall we talk about that?
See, that, you started by saying about the past being the present, being connected with the past, and also the basis of the future. Yes. You know, we can again look at what that colonial education was doing to us generally, particularly through language. It was creating really an elite whose mind was more in tune with the mind of the colonizing entity. By that I mean, there is actually, I think you know Macaulay, I think 1834, is that correct? You know Macaulay? Yes. The Minutes on Indian Education, right? Yeah, I think you know him, or you've heard of him. Anyway. Yeah. Everyone talks about him. But it's very interesting because what he said is applicable to the colonial elite as a whole. Okay? And you remember what he said? We don't want this business of Sanskrit and Persian. English from now onwards will be the basis of education. Forget that Sanskrit had all these epics. This is what you're saying. Forget that it's got all these epics of Mahabharata, Ramayana, all these Vedic literatures, Puranas, and or the others. English is to be the way. But the thing I remember, because it might be very in tune with everything I've seen of the post-colonial situation, is what he said about we want a class of Indians. Indian in name of color, religion, everything else, but the key thing with an English mind. And then he was even more brutally honest, because he says, and we want them because then they'll come between us and the vast population that we govern. Now, in essence, this was actually the philosophy of the colonial system as a whole. Create a class, because they cannot rule everybody directly. Get a class of natives educate them, to give them the colonizer outlook on the world, okay? And then they'll come as, they'll be functioning as our allies against their own people. In reality, it does not always work like that. Because in reality, you can read the Bible, you can know how to read, you know how to read the instructions of the colonial, but that also makes you be able to read the Bible and be able to interpret for yourself, or read philosophy, or read Karl Marx.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
So it's not, but in intention, that was the intention, to create this class of natives who become allies of the ruling. But colonialism did not fail completely, actually. That mentality of which identifies with Europe as the beginner of, and somehow or other, as the West, as somewhere where the knowledge began or begins, can affect us sometimes in one form or another.
But beyond that, the fact that we, since independence, quote unquote, what has happened to that national movement, that freedom movement?
Yeah.
And who has actually, what happened to those parties? You talk
because
about
Because we did what we did.
Yes.
Really, I don't know about India, but I know in Africa, we normalized the abnormalities of the colonial system.
Yes, this
Yeah.
is...
We nationalized abnormalities of the same system. We Africanized the abnormalities of that.
So the emergency laws, for example, got replaced by public security laws.
Yeah, sometimes you get emergency laws which are passed in the colonial era being given a new name, right? Of course, it's the most obvious example that actually in the case of Africa, like Kenya and other places, the army which yesterday was killing nationalists on behalf of the colonial state, the following day, it was the one who carried the national flag. Mobutu, you mentioned Mobutu.
Yes.
Mobutu was a colonel in the Belgian army. He was fighting Lumumba. He would have killed Lumumba, right?
Or Idi Amin was very much
Idi Amin, for instance, was also part of the British army and so on. So overnight, the forces which were actually fighting against nationalists or anti-colonial nationalists now became the bearers of the flag.
Yes.
But that's only one example. There are many others, actually not always visible. Some of the laws which became national laws were actually, as I said, normalization of abnormalities of the colonial system. The economic, when you think of colonialism, it was not just cultural. It was economic, it was political. It was a question of who owns which mines, or who extracts copper or diamonds or gold and so on. So again, unless you deal with that economic base of your independence, you can have political independence, but without economic independence, you are still dependent. Right.
But it all comes together, doesn't it? Because culture, after all, is not something divorced
Separate.
from
No, exactly.
the economic.
When you think of, okay, that's right. When we think of let me put it this way. The colonial education generally, and the education generally, not just colonial, by the way, tends to teach not connections, but try to teach as if entities are separate. Even the way we are trained, I'm a historian.
Linked with
I'm a
ethnic
geographer.
divides.
I'm an economist. I'm a literature guy. I see there's no connection between all those processes, this demarcation of knowledge. So colonialism was primarily economic. But economic control is impossible without political control. But economic and political control are really incomplete without cultural control. Because when you control the culture of a people, you are controlling the values contained in that culture. And ultimately, those values are the basis of how people collectively and individually identify themselves. The value system we have, cultural or whatever, is the basis of our collective and individual sense of self. Destroy that, and somebody might not quite know where they are, right? So they are all connected. If you just take political and you don't deal with economic, you're only dealing with half the problem. And in a way, that's we talk about Fanon. This Fanon was talking about, really, in that chapter you've been referring to. Our conversation, Fanon keeps on cropping up. And that chapter, brilliant chapter in The Wretched of the Earth, called The Pitfalls of National Consciousness.
That's right.
Is really incredible in its insights. So you cannot deal with the political. The political is also economic. The economic political is also cultural. The economic, cultural, and so it's a question of psyche, the mind. They are connected.
But which brings us to the kind of distorted, perverted nationalisms that we have. We were talking just a little while back about white nationalism in the United States, or the kind of Hindutva nationalism here. And you were talking to me about Kenya as well.
Again, there's a connection. Let's look for those connections. But before I do that, I want to read something from two things. One from
Petals of Blood.
My novel called Petals of Blood, which some people argue that along my play, marijuana may have also been part of my detention, but I don't know. I believe the play in Ngũgĩ was really the basis of my detention, or imprisonment without trial. Now, in my novel, this particular novel, there is a section where students in a particular school, the particular school has a headmaster, a white headmaster, who is, his name is Fraudsham, like Fraudsham, okay? And he's very strict as a teacher, he's very blah. But, and at one time, there is a strike in a school led by somebody called Chui, like, not lion, but leopard. Oh.
A subplot this evening.
Yeah, like leopard, okay? And he was talking about black power or something like that. Chui is expelled from school. But now there's a new strike by a younger generation of students in the school. And they are demanding Africanization of the syllabus, and they are demanding an African headmaster of their school. Most important, they were demanding that Chui become the headmaster, because he would understand their situation, okay? Because he was expelled from the school. Okay. So, when they hear that Fraudsham is leaving the school, and Chui is coming as the headmaster, the whole school is in a, so they say they waited for Chui's arrival with kind of thing, dancing. Okay? And they are with heart-rending songs of, they would end up by Chui, okay? They are waiting for him So the first assembly, we went to the hall almost 1 hour before his arrival. We sang and clapped and made a few speeches. The white teacher stood outside and talked nervously about his outcome. Chui arrived. Deathly spectral silence. He climbed the steps up to the foyer. Our eyes were glued to the scene before us. Alas, he had khaki shorts and shirt and a sun helmet, a black replica of Rodsham. We waited for words that would somehow still the doubt and the fear. He spoke and announced a set of rules. He thanked the teachers for the high standards and worldwide reputation of the school. It was his desire, nay, his fervent prayer, that all the teachers should stay, knowing that he had not come to wreck, but to build on what was already there. There would be no hasty program of Africanization, reckless speed invariably being the undoing of so many a fine school. There had been recent breakdown in discipline, and he vowed that with the help of all, he would resolve it. Far from destroying the royal road to order and stability, the only basis of sound education, he would build it. A school, he said, was like a body. If you read Mahabharata, please listen to this. A school was like a body. There had to be the head, arms, feet, all performing their ordained functions without complaints for the benefit of the whole body. Then he read a passage from William Shakespeare. The heavens themselves, the planets, and this center of sub-degree, priority and place, incision, cause, proportion, season, form, office, and custom in all line of order. I won't read the whole poem, but and then he ends up, take but degree away, and tune the string, and hark what discord follows. You disturb that hierarchical structure, for him in discord. Those, he says, those are words of a great writer, greater even than Milo and Hadley Chase. The school's tradition, which had stood the test of time, had to be maintained. He did not therefore want to hear any more nonsense about African teachers, African history, African literature, Africans this and that. Whoever heard of African, Chinese, or Greek mathematics and science? What mattered were good teachers and sound content. History was history. Literature was literature. It had nothing to do with the color of one's skin. The school had to strive for what the famous educator had described as the best that had been thought and written in the world. Racism had been the ruin of many a school, many a state, many a nation. Syriana, the name of the school, believed in peace and the brotherhood of man, not women. He would never, well, he didn't say that in the book, but he would never have a school run by rebels and gangsters. And the European foreigners should have nothing to fear. And then he goes on, and he ends up by saying, teach them good idiomatic English. Right? This was the new headmaster.
Thank you.
What I'm trying to say
But maybe this is a good time for us to also, a lot of people like to say, well, writers should not be talking politics, should not be politicizing things. And of course, I don't even have to ask you your views because you actually were in detention and you wrote a novel on toilet paper, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So I think this is an experience that those who have not read your book on your detention should hear. And the fact that the writer has to be partisan.
Yeah. You see, first of all, literature does not develop in a vacuum. For one thing, even the words we use are from languages already in use. We don't really quite invent our own languages. Like a writer, I invent my own language, nobody can read. I use words of languages already used, words with their own history and other world view and other things, When I write of a character who falls in love, for instance, love, love does not occur in a vacuum. They meet in a place. There is no why, maybe in a school or somewhere, there's a context, okay? You're not going to fall in love with a person you never met. So you've got children of deprived classes and children of the very, very, very rich. They are not going to meet. Therefore, how going to fall in love, for instance, Anyway, what I'm trying to say, literature does not develop in a vacuum. The best way of putting it this way, literature is actually a product of history, of real material world. But literature has this other unique thing of being able to reflect that world at the same time, to reflect the world. And then literature has a third aspect, which is very interesting, is it reflects upon that world. Yeah. So it's a product, it reflects, it's a reflection of that world, but it reflects upon that world. Those three elements of literature, very, very important. So take Shakespeare, beloved of the colonial system. I think we're talking about this day. In my school, we used to do Shakespeare every year. And some of us graduated from high school thinking that Shakespeare was the only playwright in the world. Actually, literally. Now, and Shakespeare, I remember in school, we were talking about Macbeth. Was one of the texts I remember. There's another one, Henry, part 1, part 4. Now, see the irony. In school where I went to, Alliance High School, we never could we have been allowed, you'd have been expelled if you were caught, say, possibly with the Communist Manifesto or something talking about violence and so on. But Shakespeare was talking about violence. What time is Macbeth? They invite Banquo, the king, and they assassinate him in their bed. Right? I mean, we're talking about political assassination. We're talking about blood, the knife, and all that, right? Think of all the history plays by Shakespeare where power is seen as coming literally from the tip of a sword. Did they have guns in those days? Probably they had. Anyway, where you can see that power is struggled for, and it takes the form of some, within Shakespeare play. Yeah. So there are coup d'etats, there's blood, there's assassinations, these people are fighting, there's fighting, and so on. Shakespeare is the most political of all writers that I know. And he's a great writer. But he's a great writer precisely because he was also able to reflect the condition of his time and so on. But I also know that the way Shakespeare was taught is as if his whole interest was in iambic pentameter. Seriously, as he spent all his life thinking, oh, tomorrow, pentameter. And then, now, oh, this pentameter, I'll give it the name of Macbeth. This other one, iambic pentameter, let's call it Hamlet. I mean, really, come on.
Yeah. I have, before I ask for questions from the audience, Ngũgĩ has very generously agreed to answer a few crisp questions. The political writer, so from there, my final question is about the writer's resistance. Resistance at this moment, in a connected way, wherever you are, wherever we are. What would you suggest? What are your suggestions?
Yes. First of all, I think we have to return to the basics. And the basics, to me, seems that we have to know where we are, really. I'm sorry to put this that way, but to me, this has become very, very important. Let me put it this way. Have you had, do you know bullying? Do you have bullying here in schools here? Bullies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a common phenomenon all over the world, you know. But you note, every bullying I know of at least, all involved shaming the body of the bullied, right? Everywhere. You know, they shame the body of the bullied, you know. It's that they want the person to feel uncomfortable about their own body, about themselves, you know. They begin to put questions to themselves, to their own body, to themselves, right? To their base and so on, okay? And this is actually the same as colonialism, you know, so make people question themselves, question their body, question their environment, you know, and so on. So really the question of where we are, connecting ourselves to our base, secure the base, to me seems very, very important as a beginning, you know, connecting, you know, rejecting hierarchy. Because this product of hierarchy, the one I talked about here in a play, is actually the curse of many societies today, whether in Europe, America, you know, or Africa. Hierarchical. The notion that some people have been born sort of something else. Now, first of all, if you want to know how ridiculous that one is, whoever, I mean, we can test it here. Before you are born, each one of you, did you write an application to say in what kind of community or in what kind of body you want to be born? Who made an application before they were born? Right? You have no choice into what community, on what kind of body you are born into, right? So your body is your starting point, right? Your body is your starting point. So when somebody make you question your own body, it's your own starting point they are questioning. They want you to have doubt about self, about your environment, and so on. It's the same with the colonial thing, all right? So they make you doubt about your names. They make you doubt about your body, about the languages you use, and so on. And they want you to accept hierarchical organization of society, where the colonizer is very, very clever, knowledgeable, and then there's a lower order of that. I think really we have to question hierarchy. And when our own societies, no matter where, reproduce that hierarchy, you get the same disorder.
In spite of, well, globalization has created new globalization as well as the...
Yeah, globalization, of course, makes use of that hierarchy in a way. And that's what you mentioned, globalization. That's another trigger word for me now. I'm going to go off. No. If you really ask me, I don't know what that lonely voice is here. You are hearing today a question of nationalisms or fundamentalisms. People talk about the religious fundamentalism, fine, I have no problem with that. But sometimes they forgot the basic fundamentalism in the world today. Because we are so busy thinking of religious fundamentalism and all that, we forget the one fundamentalism at the base of them all, which is capitalist fundamentalism. Okay? And I want to read, can I read from this book?
Absolutely.
A little bit? Which was issued by Seagull Publishers. Contains actually some essays, which I did some years ago, and I was sort of, when I was very disturbed by what was happening in the world, and I didn't feel that people were, we always like to think we are the only one who are seeing, so excuse me for that. But, and I was arguing, let me just read this section, that I looked at globalization, and I looked at the World Bank, I looked at what they call General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and all that. I looked at those, it's normally called the Bretton Woods institutions. And I saw it as if they signal the globe as a theater for actions of finance capital. Now, then I look at the globalization, I say it's a tendency which was already there. There's always a globalizing tendency of capital. Because remember, its emergence in modern West, for instance, it was accompanied by exploration to India, to America. Remember, those journeys of explorations were actually part of the genesis, if you like, of the dominance of capital, right? So I argue, basically, but you can read the whole book, by the way, here. So I don't want to spoil the... I'll not read the most interesting part, okay? So, globalization today, then, is the maturing of a tendency and process inherent in capitalism. However, if globalization has been at the tendency and context of the process of capitalist modernity, there's a difference between its pre- and its post-Cold War manifestations. The earlier phases and forms paid homage to the notion of laissez-faire, at least, even when the inevitable monopolies were telling a different story. Free competition assumes different paths towards the same capitalist paradise. What characterizes globalization in its current form is the ideological and practical imperative of capitalist fundamentalism, what some call neoliberalism. I call it fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, economic, political, or religious, is essentially an insistence that there's only one way of organizing reality. Margaret Thatcher's often cited phrase, "There's no alternative," or Tinaism, best illustrates this in relation to politics and economy. But it embodies the same reductionism as does religious fundamentalism. There is, like this, there is only, this capitalism, and it says, it's like a religion itself. It says, there is only one God. His name is market. And the West is his only guardian. Enter ye and throw your fate at the tender masses of the market. But in reality, the tender masses are belied by the invisible writing on the wall. I cannot, but the Latin part of it, but I would abandon all hope. Maybe I'm sure Gayatri knows all these things. Latin.
Don't listen.
No.
This is for everybody else.
No, because I called her and she said, I'm now learning Chinese. Then I'm now into Japanese, into Kiswahili. Anyway, This phrase is a well-known phrase, abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. It's from Dante, I believe. The voice of those who might see the writing on the wall are drowned by the calls for the worship of the market, literally, with the common credo of privatization, reduced to a maxim, privatize or perish. If a nation deviates from the ordained path, for instance, by questioning the disciplinary mechanisms of aid, conditions, or failing to privatize public enterprises and introduce narrowly defined forms of liberal democracy, then it faces excommunication from the global capitalist temple and expansion into purgatory. And this afternoon I was talking with somebody, a lady Jane, who knew Julius Nyerere, and Julius Nyerere, who had some form of some kind of such, was really crushed by pressure he got from the international organizations trying to prevent him from ensuring that his different form of organized society could, what he called Ujamaa, could succeed. So I just want to end the last, this radical turn then conceptualizes capitalism as a religious system with the market as the mediating deity in the conflicting claims of its adherents. The market is a supreme deity guarded by a band of armed angels, apostles, and priests who assign hell for the unrepentant sinner, purgatory for those showing signs of repentance, and paradise for the saved. It is Dante's system of hell whose consequences I try to explore in my novel, Wizard of the Crow. If you really wanted to understand globalization and what's happening, its meaning and what's happening, think of before the 70s, after independence. The cry was nationalization of our resources. Made in Kenya, made in India, was a clarion call. But since the colonial powers for hundreds of years were the ones who were in control of all the resources, what was the implication of this country saying that they will be in control of their resources? So 20 years later, something comes up. Actually, government are a very bad thing. Nationalism is a very bad thing. The key thing is privatize. Give. Actually, okay, I don't mean that. It's very serious, but it's also funny in some ways. Because, let me just stand here to stretch my legs also. What we are told, think of government as a company. For this, in which, whether black, white, poor, rich, whatever, has a share in the government, which is the vote. Meaning, every 5 years, no matter how badly it's done or not done, but you have a sense that you can vote or you can have a say in what this company is doing, okay? Then somebody comes and tells you, actually, this thing in which you have a share is very bad. It's very inefficient. And it's better for you to have to trust a company, a corporate entity, of which you have no say. Right? The one where you might have a say, you told, no, it's very inefficient, it's very poor, don't touch it. But please trust the one over which you have no say. Right? And this is what really, in some ways, is happening with the result of misery. If you note carefully, the gap between the very wealthy, tiny, and very poor is widening and deepening in every country in the world. Also, the gap of poverty and wealth between a handful of nations, mostly Western, and that of the rest of the world, particularly from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, is all deepening, widening, right? But at the same time, our middle class in those countries now actually depend for their survival, even employment, on these corporations. Because what government were told, don't finance universities, don't sort of help in healthcare, don't privatize, or perish. Right? To me, this is a real problem. And this generates, for me, other fundamentalism, religious particularly, some in alliance with that capital, and others in opposition to what are the consequences of that capital. Only that they see it in religious terms. We are being oppressed because we have this religion and that kind of thing, right? So, to me, if we had finance, we have to go back to the question of capitalist fundamentalism. And I urge everybody to please read this book, Secure the Base, and think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that, powerful summing up, will you forgive us if we don't take questions? Instead, we'll use the next 15 minutes for those who would like to get their book signed to come up and get signatures.